All right, in the build-up to the BRICS Summit, let's cross back to Gallagher Estate, where the Energy Forum is underway.
There's subsidies, then there's green bonds, there's sustainable finance, there's PPPs, there's risk mitigation instruments. And it's really about how we package all of us to enable participation by South Africans in this green growth economy. And this will ensure that, there is inclusivity and no one in our country gets left behind. We have seen that work very well with the IPP program. I think one thing that I can really commend our government on is providing the policy certainty when it comes to green investments. We saw with the IPP program. We saw also with the opportunity, of increasing the limit around self-generation, and how that actually, brought about a lot of private sector participation in this. We have to do this in a way that puts less pressure on the fiscus, and that's why the policy uncertainty then drives private sector participation. Secondly, we should not be dictated to by the funding. We need to find an optimal solution that is, that talks to us as a country and our development goals as well. So that is really our focus as a DFI, to then say, how do we enable inclusivity in this growth green economy, and providing the instruments and the finance for that participation.
Thank you very much. James, over to you.
Thanks, Karen. Hopefully you can hear me over the noise. After all the Mzansi talk, I thought we'd move to Iceland for this discussion. I think that, as the Energy Council, we've always said, and we've tried to focus on being a doing organization. And in the way we frame that, we consistently come back and say energy is a service. It has to service our economy, it has to service our business, and it has to service our people as all South Africans. I think load shedding has been very tough in that regard, that we all feel it as citizens and as people, as businesses, and it's caused a lot of damage to our economy, and especially small businesses. And so it's really created a lot of focus on the energy crisis. But I'm going to borrow from the minister who said recently we're a noisy democracy and we should celebrate that and we should appreciate that. And so I think sometimes we see there's a lot of noise in the system, and we lose sight of maybe some of the things that are working and what we are doing. So certainly from the Energy Council, I think that there is a plan. It's a clear plan. It's a good plan. And it's called the Presidential Energy Action Plan. And it has two fundamental objectives of solve load shedding and fundamentally transform our energy sector. I think the establishment of NECOM, which was actually set up as the Energy Crisis Committee with 10 focused work streams, has really been supported and is doing amazing work in moving against those objectives through the partnership that the President has sort of endorsed, and also supported by the Minister as well as the Electricity Minister, of bringing business and government together to work on these challenges and work against those objectives. So certainly against the first one in terms of solving load shedding, we've just in the recent 2 weeks, we've had 4 technical visits to power stations. I think that Eskom is doing amazing work. We sometimes forget that probably our best technical and engineering skills still reside in Eskom. And we need to get back to be able to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the good work that Eskom is doing. I think that there's some phenomenal successes they're having, certainly are moving in the right direction. And we do need to recognize that is going to result in real good, positive sort of results in terms of solving load shedding. That's going to be in the very short term. We need energy security. As we move medium, long term, we know that we have to decarbonize, we have to move towards sustainability. And again, I think across the energy, the work streams in NECOM, if we look at the reform focus and programs, the technical work that's being done there is also phenomenal. I think very often it's not realized how much pre-work has already been done around looking at market creation, sector reform, wheeling, grid expansion, all of these fundamental pieces that we know we have to engage on and is going to be part of our journey. There's a lot of work that's been done. And again, I think that reform message, and I think, must commend also the Minister and his team that we now do have, the ERA has been through the first reading at Parliament. And really that sponsorship kind of clearly indicates that the government is behind the reform program of how we need to progress our energy sector in order to sort of progress where all of the BRICS economies and a lot of our middle income peers have moved to already in terms of reform. So I do think under the Presidential Energy Action Plan, if we look at the CEO pledge and the way business and government are coming together to work in partnership, it's a fundamental shift in the way we've worked. It's never been an opportunity that we've had in the past. And I think this is really going to be a very positive and good opportunity for us to move in the right direction and help solve load shedding as well as our energy crisis going forward. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much for that, James. Minister, I want to spend a minute just bringing you up to speed. So we've started this conversation this morning, and what we really want to talk about is policy development and funding facilitation to help us to enable, I think, accelerated action and accelerated delivery out of the energy transition, and to help us to deal with the many, many things, the many challenges that we've got to address to move forward with the transition. Minister, we also reflected a little bit this morning that our challenges, in as much as we've got environmental sustainability challenges, we've got this big focus on social, we've got this big focus on economic development, and I think in Africa specifically, the developing world, not leaving communities behind as we transition. So those are some of the key points that we've covered a little bit so far. I think as you walked into the room, Brian was outlining all of the policy actions that we need to focus on. Ms. Mabelane outlined some of the requirements from a funding perspective. And I think we had Ms. Masako step in and say what the funding institutions are already looking at and where are some of the points that we could look at a little bit further. So with that in mind, Minister, a short summary, perhaps I could hand over to you for your opening remarks and maybe to also just share some of the deliberations you've had with your colleagues during the recent BRICS meetings and what we can basically learn from them and where we are moving together as an alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director, fellow panelists, everybody. My apology for coming late. I'm pulling out of a very intensive political program in Tswana. And when I shared with my colleagues that you are gathering here, they said, no, go there, that's a very important constituency. Go and make your point there. Let me start off by saying, yesterday we had a meeting of energy ministers of BRICS. I took one provision out of that meeting from the Chinese colleagues. And they said, talking about transition, they say, make sure that you strengthen the new to a level of reliability before you dismantle the old. Now, I took that as a very, very important advice that sometimes when we talk, a debate that is polarized, want to rush into what is new and actually collapse with the new having dismantled the old. So they say, ensure that the new is strong enough, is reliable, you can trust it, then you dismantle the old. I think that's a good advice for us for the transition, because the transition has been described in many ways. Some have described this transition as moving from coal to renewables. Far from facts, it's not factual. It is movement from high carbon emission to low carbon emission. And that low carbon emission, that transition, which is a journey, is going to have diverse pathways. And we must actually use all those pathways to ensure that our transition doesn't collapse us. That's why in our IRP, which is our framework, we've made provision even for coal. We've made provision for nuclear. We've made provision for gas. We've made provision for renewables, solar, wind, hydro, and all these pathways. We think that a combination of them will help us navigate the transition more carefully and more in a more reliable way. So the load shedding that we're having, from where I'm seated, I'm going to stop now so that I don't close the debate. The load shedding that we're going through is quite a difficult load shedding. It's a combination of two things from where I'm seated. One was the question of making an assumption that we must just quickly move out of coal without ensuring that the new replaces the capacity that was provided by coal. That's why energy availability factor of individual coal power stations collapsed. It collapsed with your living there, Brian. You left it there and then it collapsed. And people think that no, coal is going to disappear and didn't service power stations. And we are having load shedding. I think what is good about Minister Ramokgopa, he's paying attention to the right issues. One of the issues is an energy availability factor, power station by power station. In that way, we're having an outside chance to actually eliminate load shedding. The second one is that which we never talk about because we only see negative, is the fact that actually we are above 90% access, we have more than 90% access to electricity in the country. If you go to certain regions, I was in Krisani last week, to discover that Krisani is actually have universal access to electricity. There are quite a number of regions like that in South Africa. We're heading for universal access. We're slow in developing generation capacity, and we must address that. And that's where we are. But transition is important. We must appreciate that it should be a transition that talks to the just part, which is justice being done, and not just being done, justice seen to be done. Number two, it must talk to people. People are not numbers. It must talk to communities, because communities may be affected negatively by the transition. We must pay attention to that. If we pay attention to those three, we are going to achieve what we want to achieve. My own view is that if you look in our program, we have an accelerated renewable program. It's very accelerated, it's going very fast. We're not slowing down, but we say other pathways must equally contribute to the transmission. Europe, which is not very aggressive on us, move out of coal, don't do all those things. Actually, their order for coal from us has grown 8-fold in 2022. That's it. They take our coal, they use it, they say move out of it quickly, but they use it. Number two, if you take Europe, Europe have accepted as EU that nuclear and gas are part of the green transition. Here we say don't touch nuclear, don't touch gas. It's a mistake that we can commit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think those are... Thank you very much, Minister. Those are some very profound insights. Minister, maybe just a follow-up question to you. I think you've indicated, that we've got a high access to electricity. We've got a whole community or a whole country to support from an electricity perspective, but we've got all of these short-term challenges. I note that you've also highlighted the work that's been done by Minister Ramokgopa, but you've also made a very important point about the new versus the old. Let's focus on strengthening the new, making it reliable before we actually start on the part of the old. Minister, how would you see from a policy perspective and maybe increasing the inclusiveness of business and the private sector that we could actually support in making that happen a lot quicker?
Thank you very much. Lobbyists call me a coal fundamentalist. I don't know why am I a coal fundamentalist. I work longer in copper than in coal. Therefore, I should be a copper fundamentalist, actually, not a copper. So, is he speaking? Let me answer your question this way. We should not decommission performing power stations. That's the first thing. We must actually strengthen them. And in the process, build new capacity. We're in a process of reviving the integrated resource plan. Please comment on it next week. We're going to release for comments phase up to 2030. Then we'll have a second phase beyond 2030. Do comment on it because that IRP must help us develop a journey that we're going to undertake. We're releasing it next week. Please do comment on it. We'll take your comment very serious. That is where the policy direction will come from. Number two, we must, the important I learned yesterday is that we should not rush in dismantling what we're having. You know, Koeberg is the only nuclear power station we have in our fleet. But it's the most efficient power station. It's the most efficient, give us the lowest cost energy, okay, than anybody else, than anything else. And it is important for us to increase nuclear capacity in our economy. The third point that we should focus on is transmission. Transmission lines were developed strong in Mpumalanga and the Transvaal, let me say so. Why? Because energy generation was in Mpumalanga. The coal belt in Mpumalanga is 13 towns of continuous coal mining. And they are the home for 12 power stations. And therefore, we didn't develop general transmission for the Northern Cape, where the potential for renewables is high. We'll have to develop that transmission. Two, we didn't develop sufficient transmission in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, which are the coastal provinces which are strong with wind. That is the backlog that we must actually focus on and invest in. The private sector can invest in those. Those are opportunities. They can partner with the state, develop those transmission lines so that we can ensure that there is availability of transmission. You know, we issued bid window 6, Brian. Yeah? Issued bid window 6. 4,200 megawatts. We could only authorize 1,000 megawatts. 3,200 megawatts could not be authorized because they could not have access to the transmission. And that actually explained to me the complexity of the problem. I normally listen to the noise. We make a lot of noise as South Africans, it's nice, but never just run after the noise. Look into things realistically and follow them, execute systematically in areas that's why equation transmission is going to be quite critical in the future. And I can tell you that we're beginning to detect that actually distribution is not in as good a shape as we assume. So that tells us what we should be doing in the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister, I'm going to let you take a break now from speaking. Thank you, but we'll give the other panelists some questions as well. And I want to start with giving Brian the difficult question, since he was part of the old, but he's also part of the new. You know, you talked about, and I'm not calling him old, I'm just saying he was part of the old as well. You've talked about the noise, and I think the noise distracts us from a lot of things in the sector. We chase after the bad noise and not necessarily the good noise. So Brian, being between, you know, the historical power generation system and now in the emerging generation system, Where do you think some of the most critical opportunities are for us to create this balance so that our system remains reliable while we deploy all of these new technologies?
Yeah, I must just tell a little story before I answer your question. I've known the minister for a long time. I know the minister for a very long time. The first time I saw him, I never met him. He was standing in Megawatt Park, and I was a young manager at Eskom. And I watched him from afar, and he used to be on the Electricity Council of Eskom. I didn't engage with him much. By the time I left this organization, I went to see him again. And Eskom just appointed a power station manager, and he said to me, "Do you think it's the right person? Does he know what to look out for at a power station?" So when people ask me about him, I said, actually, you know, you have the one person that actually knows how the South African energy system has been built. And so we must forget about the noise as a country, and we must learn from our colleagues from BRICS countries. So here we're part of BRICS. We're part of learning from China that has the largest energy system in the world, that adds renewables at the pace of all of South Africa's energy capacity annually, that move transmission energy over thousands of kilometers from the east of China to the west of China through high voltage transmission line. And I see Jacob at the back there, that the transmission of South Africa developed and shared that technology with China. How at ultra high voltage, at high altitudes, to move massive amounts of power. China does that today for the renewables. They do that for Three Gorges. We have Brazil, the largest renewable energy system in the world, driven by hydro capacity, that has the Amazon, that has to deal with off-grid solutions in the Amazon that are renewable. We have those same issues in Africa. We have India that runs energy efficiency programs, that adds renewables, that makes all of this. And so that is the benefit of which we can learn from as South Africa. So what do we have? We have as a country and as a continent unlimited energy resources. But most of our people has got no power. Now how do we get from that to where energy becomes the cornerstone of our economies, the cornerstone of our socio-economic development? It is by an integration of using our energy sources that we have, that infrastructure we have, that is both the generation we have, the transmission we have, and add the new, where it is the gas resources we have, the unlimited sun, the unlimited wind resources we have. Now, all of that can only be achieved in South Africa or on the African continent by a partnership between government and the private sector. And that partnership can be funded, can be developed if there's absolute policy certainty. And certainly as a private sector player in South Africa today, there's nothing that precludes us in the policy environment today. And this is just a year later from when we started. A year later, we can build as big a power plant for a private sector player as what we like, and all we have to do is register that. And so there's very little policy encumbrance. So when we talk about restructuring and all of this noise, it doesn't deal with energy security, it doesn't deal with affordability, it doesn't deal with sustainability. We need that policy certainty, which I think today, that's what we should be focusing on. And so we tend to focus on the noise. We tend to not look at the massive opportunity we have. And that's what we should use. And that's what and you look at companies, and Priscilla will talk about Sasol, how Sasol is transforming massively. You look at the work that the DBSA is doing around the funding for new projects in the private sector and infrastructure funding. We have it all. We just have to focus on the execution thereof.
Thank you for that, Brian. And I think you've led nicely and invited Priscilla to make comments as well. So, Priscilla, maybe to hand over to you. You also, in the business sector that you are in, traversing quite significantly between the new and the old, and I think venturing into some very new avenues that you haven't been before. So maybe your reflections and how you're dealing with the noise as well.
I think perhaps it's quite important to be pragmatic so that we address the noise. And to the Minister's point around energy mix and the sources, which is very important. And you just look at gas, which is one of the abundance of resources that Africa has, whether we look at South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique. But our ability to be able to move at scale, to be able to utilize that in our low carbon solutions as we transition is being delayed. And we get into a stage where at some point it becomes a crisis. So what are those policy collaboration bilaterals? And you look at what China is doing from a gas to power, as Brian said, that we can actually learn from, so that it's not networks and dialogues, it's pragmatic master plans that we develop and accelerate to ensure security of supply. A significant sector like ourselves and others that are hard to abate are dependent on gas. The gas to power is going to be important in terms of the grid stabilization as we move forward, as the Minister said. Then I'm going to move on into fair trade, because it's one of the key elements where collaboration can also play a critical role. We're seeing that as the world starts to decarbonize, measures such as carbon border adjustment mechanisms are going to be quite challenging and inhibiting for our economic growth. South Africa is dependent on export. The carbon intensity of our products is going to have a huge impact on a lot of sectors that are so fundamental to our economy. So then from an energy perspective, from these BRICS partnerships, where do we start looking at opportunities for fair trade, for some of our minerals, our resources, that we can ensure that we continue to develop, but also collaborations around policy advocacy at a global scale to have impact from BRICS, because these are the strongest economies of the future world. So how do we leverage that as fast as possible? And then I'm going to get to the third element around some elements that we don't talk about is areas such as bio, where you look at what Brazil has done, and you start looking at that as a source of energy as we move forward. We have huge unemployment of the youth. Women are not included in the economy. And these are opportunities, the circular economy, the bioeconomy, that we can start tapping into to start unlocking the technologies and the capabilities to address the youth. The other day I went to Orange Farm. There was an exhibition of a summit of innovation in the energy sector. I was impressed with just young, talented individuals and of the youth that are looking and are innovative, but they don't have the economic capabilities and funding to scale up some of the circular economy opportunities that they're driving. So these deliberations must actually have those actions that we can follow through to ensure that we move forward. My last comment would be to the Minister's part that as we transition, decarbonization and the and energy security or economic inclusivity are much linked together. And earlier on I spoke about the human-centered approach. If we thus start partnering on the grid and leverage projects that are there to create that, such as the green hydrogen, they open up access to grid at scale with new investments coming in. And how do we then connect that? Minister Mantashe, now and then when I see him and I meet with him, he tells me about this triangle economy. It's actually all smelling fresh air while you're in the dark. So that's sticking in my head. And then I look at it and I'm saying, in that triangle economy, how do we then make sure that the areas that the Minister mentioned, we don't leave them behind, we unlock value from that grid access in terms of that. So it's those moving at pace and ensuring that we really leverage on the private sector, but understanding that the cost of capital for South Africa is a challenge, and the BRICS partnership then brings that funding mechanism for us to unlock value. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mabalane. I think a lot of interesting points, but maybe to pick up just on one big concept that I think you're talking about, which is the concept of inclusivity. And very often inclusivity comes from having strong facilitative funding. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ms. Masako. Maybe you can reflect on how do we create this inclusive environment? How do we give it some impetus with the funding instruments and mechanisms that we have? And maybe if, from your perspective as well, is there anything that you're seeing in the BRICS Alliance that we can leverage and learn from?
No, definitely. I think, the way we're looking at the space we find ourselves in is that we need to make sure that we optimize job creation, local economic and skills development. So in this journey that we were on, there must be minimal disruption, but maximum, benefits in this path that we are on. So the way we are looking at it is there's the now, there's the medium term, and there's a long term. And when we look at now in terms of solutioning for the current energy crisis, which is what the minister and the Minister of Electricity is driving and working on. Strengthening the grid capacity, and I think that is what the minister also touched on, and what Priscilla touched on to then say we actually need to collaborate and actually have a war room around this transmission grid, and then saying how do we come together, and so collaboration is key. I think we need to be better coordinated in terms of finding solutions. There is the medium, there is the opportunities around generation. We as an institution have the battery storage program that we are running as DBSA. We also have the embedded generation investment program where we are supporting private sector, and we are also supporting our municipalities with self-generation. Then there's the long term around taking advantage of technologies, building a hydrogen economy there. And there we have recently launched a $1 billion fund with other partners to then say, in the longer term, and this is a much longer term, we're talking 10 to 15 years, how do we then do that? When you have a plan like that, then you know that there is no point where you will be left behind. And it's important that we do not focus on one thing, but actually have this dynamic approach to addressing our energy security as a nation. Underbedding all of that, what is going to be critical? We have the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and I think Priscilla also touched a little bit on that, is that, just as much as we are engaging at BRICS, what are the engagements around energy security as the Southern Africa power pool, in terms of taking, advantage of those green minerals. Brian touched on, we have everything. All we need, we have all we need to really do what we need. So it is important that, there is that collaboration around how we take advantage of, the green minerals as well. So for us as the DBSA, it's really about how we, use our project preparation funds, how we leverage these international and the funds we get from the various funders. For instance, we are accredited with the Green Climate Facility and the Green Environmental Facility as well. We have recently secured $235 million for instance, for water projects. We secured $200 million for, embedded energy projects where we finding concessional funds. We're using the strength of our balance sheet. We're using our brand, equity as an institution to get concessional funds so that we can blend and make funding cheaper. Reduce the cost of funds for the various projects. So it's project preparation to de-risk the projects that we provide, so that they can reach financial close, and we can, crowd in private sector as well, in these projects. From an inclusivity perspective, the gap always remains equity. It's about how we find, providing the equity instruments, to then enable, enable that, because we come from a history that is unequal as you know, and it's like there's an expectation that in a project a black person must come up with tons and tons of millions. It's like, where are you going to get those millions from? So it's really about how we, as an institution, make facilities available. The third thing that, the last thing I want to touch on is we have developed a portfolio called High Impact Investment Portfolio. And within that portfolio, we are specifically looking at, supporting technologies that drive economic growth, and from that facility, we are actually supporting a black female who's developing fuel cells in the hydrogen sector as well. And we have, a specific pool of funds, for women-owned businesses as well. As a development finance institution that drives economic development for the region, it is important for us to really have the now, medium, and long term. And we do that to ensure that there is participation for our communities. Underpinning all of this, and I cannot emphasize it enough, is the industrialization agenda. I was reading in the paper the other day that there's 4 gigawatts of solar on our rooftops. Where did all of those panels come from? And this is now going back to the trade engagements we have with our BRICS countries, and the industrialization as well. At the end of the day, we always have to ensure that we have the interest of South Africans at heart, the interest of the people of this continent at heart in the engagements and the agreements we enter into. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Masako. I think many points, but the one that I think James is going to be very appropriately positioned to comment on, being the Chief Executive of the Energy Council, this cog, that's looking to bring the sector together and create alignment. James, let's talk about building collaboration in the sector. What do we look at? How do we do that? How do we create this alignment? And then, the minister mentioned something about measuring the outcomes. So I think we've got good scorecards for technical things that we can measure. How do we create these other scorecards that give us transparency in terms of what are we achieving in the transition?
Thanks, Karen. Maybe I could just come back to the concept of energy as a service, because I think if we can break that down, we could be very practical and talk about what's happening on the ground, rather than sort of what are the concepts that and the ambitions that we have. So if we took energy as a service, we know that there's a supply side. What technologies are in that? There's a demand side. How will that shift in the societies and communities who are going to need energy services? Then there's the infrastructure component, which includes municipal utilities, which are very important, sustainable municipalities, the infrastructure, the grid. And the last component that we have to think about is really then the markets, which includes...
All right, so what you've been watching on your screen there is the first day of the BRICS Business Council. Quite a number of discussions coming up on energy security as well as infrastructure. This, of course, the build-up to the main event, which is the BRICS Summit, which is coming up. We're expecting, of course, key leaders from the BRICS countries to engage on a number of things affecting the countries associated with BRICS. We'll go to Katlego in just a short moment. He will give us the latest from there. But of course, it is the first day of this and the BRICS bloc ahead of the upcoming 15th BRICS Summit. South Africa will play host to delegates from Brazil, Russia, India and China for the summit in Sandton from the 22nd, of course, to the 24th.